You know why I'm dressed up? Because, when I do this course, and when I do the first half of the French course, I do a lecture on the bourgeoisie, the middle classes. And middle class was a form of self-identity that was constructed in the way being a worker was constructed, or being a noble. And one day, I was about to come off and go out among you all and talk about Daumier and show you some Daumier slides about the bourgeoisie. And my wife said to me, "You can't go talk about the bourgeoisie looking like you usually do. You got to look like you mean it, like you have a vague sense of knowing it." And so as a result, look at this. So I wear this about once a year. Unfortunately, I wear it to funerals. And last time I wore it was something Bill Clinton had through mutual friends. And I only have one tie that I share with my son. And we had to find him another tie underneath his soccer shoes. And then we got into New York and went to this party, and we're all dolled up, and all that. And then we went out to a restaurant. I lost my tie, my one tie. And the last time I bought a tie, the ties cost $15. And then in Ann Arbor, I bought a tie for, this is $75 tie, so this is my only tie. So that's a long way of answering your question about why I look like this today. But I hope to make some sense of that, in the lecture. So thank you very much. I didn't set that question up, did I? I didn't ask you, please ask that question. But I want you, when you're looking at me dressed, it's not Halloween. That's the first thing I thought. When you look at me dressed like this, please try to think, knowing me a little bit as you do, why it was that it meant a lot to dress like this in the 19th century. Because the middle classes started dressing like this in the 19th century. Dark, with a little bit of color. And when you see Daumier, or you see Delacroix's famous, which I forgot the slide, Liberty Leading the People, and you see the bourgeois there with his top hat, he's dressed in a bourgeois uni like this. And so that emerges out of the bourgeois century. And so while last time we talked about the construction of class identity for ordinary people, for working people, the bourgeoisie had as strong a sense of self-identity as any social class you could imagine. And it was, as I'll make the point in a minute, it was difficult to get into that class if you weren't born into it, but it was the fear of falling out of it was something that helps motivate lots of political things in the 19th century. And the 19th century, in terms of being the bourgeois century, one of the things you see in countries, particularly in Western Europe, in Great Britain, in France, and in Germany, and in Italy, is you see the middle classes wanting the political power commensurate with their economic status. And if in the 18th century, this is one of those truisms that happens to be true and can be exaggerated, but if the aristocracy, you're born into the aristocracy. If you hit the big time and you get lucky, you can buy your way in, thanks to the broke French monarchy. But the ideal aristocrat, and this was how an aristocrat would have talked about him or herself, was born into the aristocracy through blood, through family. It was an ascribed status. And in the 19th century, one of the things that happens with the French Revolution and with Napoleon is that the middle class person and middle class values seem to be something to be emulated. And once we've got an increase in the wealth of the middle classes and the diversity and complexity that I'll talk about in a minute, then you wanted a political power. You wanted the right to vote. You wanted access to information through the press and the print culture. All of these things are closely tied to the middle classes. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. Most of it is about bourgeois culture. And so that's why I'm dressed like this. And I assure you that the minute this lecture is over, I will go back and like I could never compare myself to Clark Kent, but I will find my phone booth and change back into normal duds. So let's talk a little bit about the middle class in in the bourgeois century. Now, the middle classes, or the bourgeoisie, are terms that we conveniently use. Marx, talked about the bourgeoisie as being this extremely, homogeneous class. In fact, the word bourgeois has really more cultural connotations, maybe than objectives or social categorization. Living in a bourgeois manner, and we'll see some aspects of that in terms of private access to private space, middle-class concepts of childhood, and that sort of thing. So middle classes is probably a better term. Bourgeois is the equivalent of burger, but middle classes is probably, for our point of view, a better term. It seems rather odd to be talking about the English bourgeoisie of Leeds, about which there's an excellent book, because bourgeois, after all, started out as a French word. But in using and indeed insisting on the term middle classes, what I'm suggesting is the enormous complexity of the middle class. There wasn't just one middle class. Yet the middle classes shared some cultural values and symbols in common, and when challenged by ordinary people, could snap back in an extremely cohesive class-based manner. And Marx had some of that quite correctly. Now, in a Parisian newspaper called the Journal des Débats, in 1847, someone actually did a pretty damn good job of describing the bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie is not a class, the person argued. It is a position. One acquires that position and one loses it. Work, thrift, and ability confer it, he argued, referring to himself, of course. Vice, dissipation, and idleness mean that it can be lost. And so that old kind of aristocratic ethos of not working, of being idle, although it can be exaggerated, as we've seen in the 17th and 18th century, nonetheless, there was something to it. An 18th century noble let his fingernails grow long, sort of just hung out, showing his good taste by living in an idle, aristocratic manner. The bourgeoisie did anything but that. Work was part of how they believed to get ahead, and getting ahead is what they wanted to do. Now, the French Revolution, and here's an important point, I guess, opened the way by removing legal blocks in very many places to the career open to talents. And Napoleon used to say tediously that in each soldier's backpack there was a marshal's baton, or staff, that you could get promoted with good work, hard work, if you didn't get your head blown off in one of these battles. But certainly one of the things that comes out of his insistence on service to the state is creating a whole series of rewards that recompensed virtuous action and hard work. I mean, that's what the Légion d'honneur, the Legion of Honor, was all about. And making money was part of it. And of course, it's always, in the 19th century, was sort of classic to poke fun at bourgeois culture, in some cases the lack of it, and to ascribe to the middle classes sort of Philistine habits in which making money was really the only thing that counted. Now, certainly, Friedrich Engels, Marx's partner, obsessed with as well he should have been, with the slums of the Satanic Mills of Manchester, he once wrote the following. He says, "One day I walked with one of these middle-class gentlemen into Manchester. I spoke to him about the disgraceful, unhealthy slums and drew his attention to the disgusting condition of that part of town in which the factory workers lived. I declared that I had never seen so badly built a town in my life. He listened patiently, and at the end of the corner of a street at which we parted, he remarked, 'And yet there is a good deal of money to be made here. Good morning, sir.' And he walked away." One employer wrote in the 1830s that relative to his workers, is that the worker, quote unquote, I couldn't invent this, should be constantly harassed by need, for then he will not set his children a bad example, and his poverty will be the guarantee of good behavior. Now, of course, this is the character of middle-class self-absorption, of narcissism, of kind of this inveterate cruelty to the classes below them. On the other hand, I mean, the more we study the middle classes, and in the 1960s, people really didn't study the middle classes because they didn't like them very much. They studied workers, but there's been an awful lot of good work done on the middle classes. Among my dear friend Peter Gay, his 5 volumes of the bourgeois century take on the idea that the middle class lived without passion. And were Philistines and that sort of thing. And the more we look at the middle class now, we see certainly that no matter where you look, that there are one of the things the middle class people did was form voluntary associations. Aristocrats didn't form voluntary associations. They didn't need to. The middle class formed voluntary associations, and many of these were for extremely charitable purposes, particularly in Britain. I mean, again, the study that I referred to by somebody called Morris, I think it's Morris, on Leeds, shows the kind of richness and depth to these voluntary associations in which people try to do an awful lot for ordinary people. It has a sense of moralizing. There's always this sort of top-down look about moralizing them, trying to get the workers to drink less, trying to get them to go to church, trying to get them to, when it was possible for their children to become educated and to stay in school. And there's always this tension between families who needed children's income, however small that was. And across the 19th century, over a very long period, laws, finally by the end of the century in most places, making at least primary education obligatory and in most cases free. I mean, here's a ridiculous example. It's not a ridiculous example if you love animals. I mean, I'm a cat person, as I already said, but the Society for the Protection of Cruelty to Animals, I mean, these sorts of organizations really, are one of the classic examples of bourgeois voluntary associations. I mean, doing good things. They also get together to hang out with each other and sort of try to gauge who has more money than the other, and they get together for social reasons in the coffee houses of England and in the clubs, the circles you call them in France, and in their equivalents in Germany and in Italy and in Spain. But one of the more ludicrous kind of devise, we call it devise, a motto of one of the Society for the Protection of Cruelty to Animals was in one of the organizations in France. It said, "One must love animals, but not fraternize with animals." I don't know what that means, but the main thing is that they wanted to save animals from being beaten, almost beaten to death in many cases of horses, and you can see how in places in which bullfighting over the long run in the 19th and 20th century, such as the very south of France and in Spain, there were always movements to try to protect the bulls, which seems like a reasonable thing to do. So for all of the bad press that the middle classes had, and you can read some of this bad press in what you're reading, there is also this good side that should be evoked as well. That's a period. And then certainly in terms of organized religion, the middle class goes to church more than ordinary people, than workers, for sure. And in the case of peasants, it depends on where, because as I said before, in many parts of France, the example that's so well studied, you still had this de-Christianization. But certainly, religion was a fundamental part of the British middle class's view of itself. And the percentage of people who went to church could, of course, be exaggerated. There was a study in all of England. I don't think it was in Wales and Scotland, but at least it was in England, maybe in Wales too, probably in Wales as well. I think it was in 1851 where they decided to look at every single church in England and Wales, let's say, and to see how many people went to church. And they found to their horror that it was less than they thought. And they also discovered that if everybody had wanted to go to church, had gone to various churches, Methodists for more ordinary people, Anglican, Catholic, for the Irish, and for a certain minority of British citizens, or Jews in the East End of going to synagogue in the East End of London, that they couldn't have accommodated all these people. So there's a massive kind of church building campaign that has its counterpart in almost every country as well. Certainly in France, after the Paris Commune of 1871, they start building churches in working class districts perched on the edge of cities. More about that in another lecture. But certainly, I mean, one can go on and on about this, but certainly religion for the middle classes has a much greater role in their life than in working class cities. And the case of the peasants, well, there weren't any peasants left in England, and I'll talk about that, and that'll be fun to talk about one of these lectures. Anyway, there we go. Now, how many people would have considered themselves middle class? And again, self-identity, how people thought of themselves, is one of those aspects that we want to discuss. How do we know? I mean, how would you know who is middle class? When they first start doing censuses, and censuses are really our 19th century phenomenon. They begin with, well, in subsequent centuries. As I said before, there were only the first censuses in Copenhagen, I think, and in the 18th century. The first real censuses do not come until the 19th century, almost everywhere. I mean, they didn't ask people, they asked you your name and where you lived. In some cases, they ask you your profession, but they did not say, are you middle class or are you not middle class? So there was a whole lot of work done in the 1970s in what they used to call the new urban history, which is sort of counting people up and deciding who might well have considered themselves a middle class. There are a lot of dissertations written on that kind of thing. There was one in the case of Paris, and inevitably I have to talk some about Paris because the work is so rich there. A woman called Adeline Domar wrote a dissertation that was subsequently published called Les Bourgeois de Paris, or the Bourgeois of Paris, in the first half of the 19th century. And so what she did is she looked at wills. The middle class people had enough money to leave wills. And therefore their inventories after death. That's what you call them, inventories after death. And that's one of the reasons we know about the explosion of print culture, because they inventoried the books that people read. I mentioned this in the context of Enlightenment too, because you do have that too. But taking the kinds of ways that she looked at social class, she determined that somewhere between 17 and 19% of the Parisian population in the first half of the 19th century would have been considered bourgeois and would have considered themselves bourgeois, that is, in the middle classes. Now, certainly in Britain, the percentage is higher. It probably approaches 25%. I can't remember the exact figures. And that percentage will continue to increase in the 19th century. And you can already very well anticipate, from you already know, where other parts of Europe that have large, important middle classes. The old Hanseatic port cities of German, and the German free cities that would become part of unified Germany in 1871, and northern German cities in general, like Bremen and Lübeck and Hamburg, above all. They have, I mean, Hamburg's a huge port city, so it's got a very enormous bourgeoisie. If you went to Madrid, you'd find a sizable middle class, but it would be nothing that you would have if you compared to Madrid to Barcelona, because Barcelona is a really natural economy based upon important economic relations between its hinterland and Barcelona, and between Barcelona and the world, because it's a major port. So you've got this big teeming middle class there as well. In the case of France, I mean, obviously places that have lots of industry and small businesses have middle class people in large numbers, so not as in large numbers as workers. I mean, Lyon would be a good example. I mean, Lyon Lyon has the most tightly closed middle class that you can imagine, and it still is. I mean, Lyon is very, very Lyon. What can one say? And again, northern Italy, you find a huge, vibrant middle class, but not in southern Italy. I mean, Naples is one of the biggest cities in Europe right through the early modern period, and you've got a large middle class, but most of Italy is extremely rural, and what you had in Rome was you had clergy in Rome, and it's a city, so you got important middle class. The further east you get, the smallest the middle class, smaller the middle class gets. Russia, the estimates are about 2% of the population were middle class, 2%, which isn't very much at all. And of course, they are clustered in Moscow and in St. Petersburg and in Kiev, now Ukraine, always Ukraine, but then part of Russia, in the large cities. In Poland, Warsaw had a large, I was just at the History Museum, a fascinating one, at Warsaw Museum, a couple months ago, and Warsaw, as Krakow had a big middle class. Gdansk, obviously, because it was a port city, but much of Poland was rural and wouldn't have that kind of middle class. Belgrade would have been the only city in the Balkans outside of Istanbul, and Istanbul wasn't in the Balkans, but with an important middle class. I mean, this is all perfectly obvious. Anyway, who are these folks, and what do they want? So, I mean, they're not all. How am I going to do this? Can I need those slides? I'm going to do it like this. You have to imagine the middle class like this, that it's a pyramid. It's a pyramid with a small top and a big bottom. And I'll give you a rather interesting, show you a lithograph that really represents this, two of these in very interesting ways, I think compelling ways at the beginning. At the very top, and this, if you think of Zurich, or any city you want. I mean, Zurich has a big middle class, so does Geneva for obvious reasons. But at the very top, there are the great bourgeoisie, the big bourgeoisie, and these are people who are big financiers. In the 19th century, bankers will become much more important for perfectly obvious reasons. These are big wholesale merchants who are making bundles, shipping things from here to there. You won't yet find lawyers and people like that. And what also makes them the high bourgeoisie or the big bourgeoisie, a small percentage, it doesn't really matter, where this line goes, is that they have access to political power. Even if they're in Prussia, a place that's dominated by the nobles, who are called the Junkers, as most of you know, they will still have access by virtue of their wealth to political power, which is exactly the way they want it. There's a revolution in France in 1830, yet another one that you can read about, and arguably, I mean, Marx says this, and in a way it's sort of true. What it does is it brings to power in France the big bourgeoisie, and they have the ear of the king, Louis Philippe, who calls himself the citizen king. He would rule from 1830 to 1848, and in the portraits of him, the paintings that he had done to represent who he was, very different than those of the Bourbon kings. The Bourbon kings are all looking like, even the kind of pathetic successors of Louis XIV, they're looking like big people in chateaus who are kings of all that they see, which of course was more or less the case. Louis Philippe's view of himself was that he was the citizen king. That's what he calls himself. He's still the king. He was noble. He was not any bourgeois. But in the official paintings of him, you see people dressed like me who are coming into the throne room. They're dressed like me in dark suits, and they have power. And he wants them in the painting with him. That's terribly revealing. It's terribly interesting. So these are people, these are big bankers, high financiers at the top. And then you've got other layers of bourgeoisie, and you could kind of fill in the gap. Here we have smaller bankers, not in size, but in money, industrialists, merchants, these kinds of people, and Daumier, the great caricaturist, least favorite people, lawyers, because lawyers rise up rapidly in popular esteem, in usefulness, and the middle class likes to see themselves as useful. And so you find lawyers reaching in there, and slowly doctors, because remember, doctors had very low social status. They were sort of a cut above, a bad pun I'm making what you read. Ordinary field surgeons during the Napoleonic battles, some of whom were butchers or people who knew how to wield a knife. And doctors increase a self-identity and become more important in the 19th century. You also find notaries, no matter what country you're in. Notaries. Now, notaries have a much bigger role in Europe than they do here. Notaries, they know where all the goodies are. When you buy property, by the way, in France, you buy property, you pay, if you have a mortgage, you pay 12% of right off the top goes to the notary, just for holding in his office your deed. If you don't have a mortgage, you pay 7% right off the top. So notaries know all of the secrets of people with money. So notaries are important in all these countries, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, you could kind of fill in the occupation. But they share things together. Then at the bottom, you have the petty bourgeoisie. And everybody's poking fun at the petty bourgeoisie. But they, too, had a self-identity. I found one day in the stacks of the library at the University of Michigan a pamphlet that was actually it was the report on what surely must have been the last, but in any case was the first World Congress of the petty bourgeoisie. And where they met, appropriately enough, in Brussels. Can you imagine going to a professional history conferences? They all have their little name tags, and all they do is they start up your body and look at your name tags to see if it's worth looking at your face. I mean, it's really pathetic. And can you imagine going to a conference like the World Congress of the Petty Bourgeoisie? And hi, World Congress of the Petty Bourgeoisie. Hi, my name is Albert. But they had a self-identity. Now, who were in the petty bourgeoisie? Well, lots of these classically new 19th century professions. School teachers. School teachers were a way of social mobility for peasant families, whether they were in Italy, whether they were in Germany, whether they were in Austria, whether they were in Hungary, whether they were in Switzerland, no matter where they were. And out of the working class or out of the peasantry, female school teachers become increasingly more important. They always were in Catholic schools because there were nuns, with the big hats and all that. And doing very good job, even though often they were undereducated and it was kind of hard for them to do that. But school teachers you'd find here, and also cafe owners or tavern owners, Weinstube owners. I'm just giving you, a couple examples, but these are the petty bourgeoisie. And also, very importantly, what do you do with artisans and craftsmen? Master artisans, they own the tools that their journeymen work with. They rent or own their shops. When things are going pretty well, they do pretty well themselves. But when things aren't going well, they don't do well. And that's why they're on the barricades all these times, as you know, in the French Revolution, the French Revolutions, and in the revolutions of 1848, as you shall discover, in Vienna and Berlin and other places. They're always there. So these folks are here too. So this is your basic, petty bourgeoisie, and people are always dumping all over them. But I will give, needlessly, but I will give you, some example. Now, in order to, if you ever read the great French, he's paid by the word, as you can see, when he has descriptions of single sofas that go on for about 2 pages. But Balzac is really the novelist of the bourgeoisie. When he describes Paris and the 17 to 19% of the population who are increasingly living in the western part of Paris. More about that another time. He describes it as a jungle. That you count your money in the morning, and then you count your money when you come home. By the way, your wife, who would in the census be listed as not working, if you were a shopkeeper, your wife is the one who kept care of the accounts. Your wife is the one who stood behind the counter when you were working, when you were an artisan. So he describes this as a jungle. So in order to really give an image of what it was like, he's got I got to find this thing someplace, but he's got this one magnificent print called the Street of the Four Winds, and that's a street in Paris, the Rue des Quatre Vents, that's near Odeon. Doesn't matter. But here's a guy dressed like me. See, there's a theme in this. He's dressed like me, and he's wearing his bourgeois hat. I don't have one of those. My only hat has an M for Michigan on it. And the hat, his one suit, isn't going to blow off his body. But the wind is taking his hat, which is a symbol of who he is, and the wind is carrying it away from his hand. And in several hundred brush strokes, Daumier captures the look of panic on his face because he's going to go home without his hat. And his wife's going to say, "Where's your hat?" And he says, "Well, the wind blew it away," and he's got to buy one, and they've got to put the money together so he is not going to fall off the ladder in this jungle. So then you have to imagine this as a ladder, like this. Social mobility is the goal, and you want to have enough money to leave to your 2.2 children. So then to really make this go, you'd have to have vines up here, like the jungle. And then you'd have to grease this pole through bad economic times. Let's say in Europe, 1816, 1817, 1820. Don't write this down, please don't. If you do, you're compulsive. I'm compulsive. But 1826, 27, 1840, 41, really bad one. 1846, 47, 1855. Those are the really bad years. And at that point, if you don't get credit, that's what's going on now here. If you can't get credit because people withdraw the credit, same thing. Then here you go. Look out below. You slide down this pole. And what happens down below here? Holy cow! That's the big sea. There's just a wretched movie called The Poseidon Adventure once, but it had an image where the water is kind of coming up below, and it's going to finally get to the top, and there's no more room to breathe. And this is how the people on the bottom part of this ladder viewed the demands of the working class, because they want to vote too. And what if they vote in somebody who wants to raise your taxes or something like that? Boy, oh boy, that's scary. But what's down here, this is ordinary people. This is the other 70, what would it be in the case of Paris? 83% of the population. And you're going to fall into the ranks of the proletariat if you're on those if you're on the bottom kind of rungs here. And so this has got to be, this is your jungle, and you're trying to make it up there to the big time. And the chances are that in these bad years, you're going to fall down. But yet lots of people get up, and the ranks of the middle classes increases everywhere in the 19th century. In Russia, too, everywhere. That's simply the case. Now, if I could just bring down this. Is that what I'm doing? Yeah, that's what I'm doing. Bring down that and show you how this works and talk about some accoutrements of middle-class culture that you will recognize, many of you. Now, this is the guy at the top. This is Daumier. Daumier is the greatest caricaturist in the 19th century and arguably ever, to make an extreme assertion, but it really is pretty true. And so this is what he captures the prevailing mood in much of Europe, in that money more than blood, if you're going to exclude places like Hungary, Poland, Spain, and Prussia. Money talks more than blood. And so what is this man doing? He's counting his money. Remember I said that you counted your money in the morning and then you came home at night and count your money again and see how you've done. That's Daumier, these people. Now this is great, because remember I said the variations within the bourgeoisie. You can see these, some of these images. I mean, this is really not very interesting art, but that's not the point. Look what this shows. Now, here the guy at the left here is a clerk. That's a very 19th century profession, as it is for every subject. He's, by the way, this is before the 1860s, because that's when real fountain pens are invented. He's got your basic quill pen there. Now look at the coats. They both have coats like mine, but there's huge difference in them. This guy, if you have extraordinary eyes, you'll be able to see and can read upside down that he is reading a newspaper on the price of colonial goods. Imports. And he is a wholesale merchant, so he's one of these people that's at the very top of my triangle there. And look at this guy's got his coat too. This is early in the century, you can tell. Now this is either the son-in-law or the would-be son-in-law, and he's put his, the bourgeoisie didn't kiss and hug a lot. But he's got his hand draped rather daintily on the old guy's arm here. He's not about to embrace him and give him a kiss, a big kiss on each cheek. And one day, all of this stuff will be his if he plays his cards right. And they still had arranged marriages. I mean, love could count for something, but marriages were still essentially, less so for the middle classes than for ordinary people, but economic relationships. That's what they were. They were economic relationships, wrangling over the dowry and that kind of thing. Now, what about, look at our guy on the left. he's working very hard there. And this pole that is put up there has a real sense of dividing these. So it's like the barriers on my quite arbitrary and not terribly well-designed triangle there. Do these people have something in common? Yes, they will in 1830, and they will in 1848, but the rest of the time they don't. He's dreaming about being this guy. But he'll work very hard, and he's educated. He will have had probably not secondary education. Most people didn't go to high school, secondary, lycée in France, or gymnasium in Germany, et cetera, et cetera. But it represents this world. And this guy, by the way, we also know that this guy's this takes place right in the center of Paris, right behind the big department store. Subsequently, the Hôtel de Ville, but right the BHV, the Bazaar de l'Hôtel de Ville, which is a big department store, but right near the town hall. So anyway, there we go. Now this is another. This is going to get my watch so I can keep track of things here. This is another. This is very common. You see this in the book you're reading, I think. But these things have their geographic. I mean, so they can be represented spatially very easily. And one of the themes over the long run is that the emergence of increased development of prosperous Western Paris, prosperous Western London, prosperous center Vienna and other places, and increasingly impoverished East and the periphery. And that's another theme. But still through much of the period, and indeed to a lesser extent still today, where you lived in a building reflected how much money you had. Now the ground floor, in French called the rez-de-chaussée, this is the concierge there. And the concierge will be somebody of very modest means. You probably place them in the petty bourgeoisie there. And then the big apartment on the first floor, high ceilings, big party, lots of people dressed like me there, a piano, more about pianos in a minute. So this is my triangle sort of upside down, isn't it? And the more you go up there, you're still within the middle class. The guy above, he's got these little Napoleonic beds there. This guy, I hope he's not closing his ears against his own baby there, but no, obviously, because this is a different house. But he's a musician. This is all rather banal, but nonetheless telling. You've got an artist up here with not much money, but he still has a little bit of furniture, not much. His nosy neighbor looking at his painting. And then on the top, you've got the poorest of them all, besides the cat who's on the roof up there. You've got a seamstress. And anyone looking at this very popular lithograph would immediately see that she has some dignity left. Why? Because she has not yet pawned her mattress. In Zola's great novel, La Samoire, Gervaise dies like a dog on a bed of straw because there was no more mattress. And she was at the very top. And now, of course, these rooms, which then became in the 20th century student rooms and then were transformed into enormously expensive lofts. But this is a way of visualizing the spatial concomitants of what I'm talking about. And people were aware of what these symbols meant. And this is your classic Hamburg financier's apartment. We don't need to go on and on about the kind of material culture of wealth, but there it is. So let's go on and on about it in another one that's easier to pick up for your eyes there. This here again, we know we're on one of the lower floors. Why? Because you see the trees outside the window. You've got a domesticated animal. Ordinary people, didn't have as many domesticated. Dogs had a real purpose. They bring the sheep down the mountain. My wife just came down the mountain 2 weeks ago, bringing the sheep down from friends of ours in the village. And all these dogs are useful things and keep the sheep in line and all of that. You've got, this is all obvious stuff, but you've got slippers. Ordinary people did not wear slippers. You've got a domestic servant. Domestic servants cost almost nothing. It was considered to be a way of moving up the ladder to say that you had 4 domestic servants instead of 3. You've got brass or copper here or the heater. That's a good sign. You've got very fancy chairs. Look, these are very good chairs, sort of Louis Philippe chairs. You've got print culture, a big old porcelain plate on the above there, and you've got that bourgeois accoutrement, the piano. The piano replaces the harpsichord. The piano, Leon Flanagan, who was in J.E. College, who's a retired professor of music. He's got great stuff on this. The role of the piano and the emergence of, along with Bill Weber, who teaches did teach it at where did he teach it? At Long Beach. The emergence of the public concert, as opposed to the chateau concert or the church concert, the public concert, and along with that comes the piano. Now, pianos were expensive, but the middle class has pianos. Working people don't have pianos. Middle class people have pianos. So you also see something else that's important here. There's more than one room. And you'll see in a minute there's even more than 2 rooms. There are lots of rooms. And what the middle class wants, all those people in that triangle, they want privacy. They want privacy. They want their own rooms. So she's playing the piano. Well, I mean, it's all obvious stuff. And there's the kitchen. Now, this is not the wife. These are the this is the domestic with her children, who are part of the team who's been hired to help run this household. There again, you see the trees. We're in the same apartment there, and you have real copper pots. Back before the Bush dollar, people would bring back, from Paris and from Europe, these enormously heavy copper pots. I've carried so many of them back. It's just incredible. And that was, ordinary people did not cook with things like that. There we go. I mean, these are the kinds of symbols of all of this. Now, the middle class wants privacy, and they also develop something else. And this is almost trite to say because so many people have said it, and it can be exaggerated. But the middle class arguably helps create the notion of childhood. That in many early modern paintings, children are portrayed as sort of little squished up adults and that sort of thing. And children come into their own in the 19th century. Ordinary people, ordinary peasants, children, they slept with the animals often, along with the adults. Most ordinary people in some of the worst tenements in Europe were in Edinburgh and in Glasgow and in Lille in France, but also in Berlin and lots of places. There were no secrets. Everybody slept in the same room. There were no secrets at all. And what the middle class wants, besides social mobility and access to political power, is they want space. And so the notion of childhood, childhood didn't exist for ordinary people. You started working, helping out, so when you were 5 or 6 years old, you started tending the animals in the little courtyard, as they would call it, taking care of chickens and rabbits and things like that. Working people, their children went to work right away as soon as they could make anything. And if they were poor and didn't have jobs, then they were sent out to beg. Childhood became a middle class phenomenon. Now, to be sure, nobles had children, but it was a different way of bringing up your children. Nobles did not send their children to public schools or even to private schools. They were educated, to some extent at least, by private tutors. And so even the notion of the children's hour, the children's room, I mean, the idea of a children's room, of having your own room or a room shared with a sibling, was something that was just inconceivable for the majority of Europeans, the vast majority of Europeans. The children's hour, I can even remember, the horror show of being summoned for the children's hour when you're supposed to come out when there were guests and run through your extraordinarily modest bag of tricks, for the guests. And then you would be sort of packing, and since I couldn't play a note on the piano, had been expelled from piano after 2 weeks and sent back to the playing fields by a nun in Portland, Oregon. I didn't have many tricks to show, but the children's hour, all of this stuff comes out of the middle class. How about birth control, for example? How about birth control? How about not having 10 or 11 children? We have friends, one of whom unfortunately just died, very older friends, who were born in the 1930s, early 30s in the south of France, and one had 13 brothers and sisters and the other 11, and they grew up in misery, absolute misery. Very Catholic family in the center of France. Now, the middle class, particularly the French middle class, they start reducing their number of children. In France, is a particular case because they get rid of, you could get around it by primogeniture, so the plot of land has to be divided up into 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 12. Or what if you own no land? Not so good. So they begin having 2.2 children or something like that. So birth control in some parts of Europe, people think that birth control really started with peasants and then moves up to the upper classes. But basically, particularly the case of France, where it's been, like most things, studied to death, birth control really begins with the middle classes, and they are limiting their children so that their children can be, fee son of and inherit the business, and hopefully be left with enough money to make it go. A print culture. I mean, that was just an example of, the whole salon, the idea of going to see art shows. It really starts in the 18th century. But, the middle class wants to be seen, rather like the Dutch middle class that we talked about in the 17th century. It wants to be seen having paintings, and they wait in line to go to theaters. This is all Daumier, and this is the morceau, the piece that you have to, you're obliged to swallow after dinner. And here's the little girl being trotted out to play a few notes for the quite bored people who are sitting there. And waiting, and even the idea of, it's your birthday, Papa, it's your birthday. You didn't take time out to celebrate a birthday if you were an ordinary person having to get to the fields at 4 in the morning in the summer, or going to work during the day. The culture of childhood is really all there. And also, there's a whole notion and here again, this would probably fit rather awkwardly into the birth control description, but there's this whole sense of being prepared that emerges for the middle class. And one of those sort of accoutrements, I once, when I gave equivalent of this lecture, I had an old battered umbrella, and I was trying to explain how people on the top rung were trying to beat down people at the bottom. I ended up smashing this umbrella, sort of like, imaginary of somebody smashing their guitar on stage. But the point is that umbrellas come with the middle class. And they are black umbrellas. They're not these big colored things you have now. The idea of protecting that one suit. I'm from Oregon. We didn't carry umbrellas because it rained all the time anyway, and I just lose it. But the umbrellas are middle class accoutrement, along with the piano, and along with the children's room, and along with the children's hour, and along with the idea of not having too many children, and along with the top hat, and with the idea of wanting access to information through the newspapers, wanting the right to vote, probably not wanting those people down below you in the ladder to vote, but demanding that you have the right to vote. They all share these things in common. And lastly, gazing at his watch, in the last 1 minute 35 seconds that remains to me, the bourgeoisie, the middle classes, and this is particularly true of Germany and France, and of England too, and of other places, they want the right to bear arms. They want to be in the National Guard. And the National Guard might hypothetically be there in case there is an invasion of France or Germany by, I don't know, some distant place, the Finns or something most unlikely. But the main reason that they wanted to join the National Guard, and you had to own property to be in the National Guard. You had to be defined as a property-owning citizen to have the right to vote. In all of these countries, the right to vote was defined until you have universal male suffrage by how much taxes you paid, how much property you own. So you can measure where you are on this ladder by how much taxes you paid. They don't want to pay a lot of taxes, but property reflects one's belief in one's own social worth, and that's the way they looked at it. No longer was it the worth of blood. Now, so they formed these National Guards, particularly after revolutions, and after 1848 or after 1830, and for a while they go march around, but these are mainly there to protect them against the workers. Should one day all these people try to rise up, climb up this ladder, well, you'll be down there to stomp on their fingers or to shoot them down. And so it doesn't last very long. Then pretty soon, this guy's tired. Hey, this isn't Daumier. I don't know who it is. It doesn't matter. It's not very good. But he's had it. He's freezing. His wife is kind of looking at him like, I don't know why you're doing this stuff, marching around in the middle of the night. No one's going to rise up anyway. This will last. His old blunderbuss there on the left will be put back in the closet or taken out to slay deer or some damn thing. But that'll be the end of it, and they'll turn it over to more professional repressive forces such as armies. Daumier's light lines, and this is the last one, disappear in this painting, which is called the Rue Transnonain. Don't write it down, in Paris. It's a street that no longer exists. It disappeared when Haussmann built the boulevards in the 1850s and 60s. It was selected to disappear because it recalled an event in the early 1830s when these bourgeois panicked and start going into a house full of very ordinary people and simply shooting them all. Simply shooting them. And the light lines disappear with Daumier. He did another one of these after a massacre in 1848 in Rouen, and it's been lost. We don't have it. Rue Transnonain, H.D. Daumier at the bottom left. And the middle classes, for all of their insistence that they have access to information, at least in the case of France, they cheered on a press law in 1835 that kept Daumier from touching political scenes such as this, which were deemed too sensitive. And the Rue Transnonain, where this happened in the center of Paris, simply disappeared. Didn't quite disappear from the collective memory of people thinking about Parisian things. So in conclusion, the middle classes extremely varied. They share much. They have a common material culture. They share a belief in achieved status as measured by the amount of property that you had. They want to vote. They want a collective voice in decisions. And for all the variety within the middle classes, so beautifully described or depicted by Daumier and other people, they still, when push came to shove, shared an awful lot in the bourgeois century, that of the 19th century. Have a good weekend. See you on Monday.